command it like zombie. Go down on me, you with your coca body. Cause this your milky for front.
Our Cabinet Administrative Secretary in charge of health, my fellow chairpersons and members of boards, managing directors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today speaking on behalf of Kenya Pipeline Company, a company that is dedicated to the cause of diversity and inclusion and has partnered with very, very many organizations to make a difference. Before I continue with my speech, I would ask all my colleagues from Kenya Pipeline to stand, led by MD, our head of the foundation is here. Please give these men and women a round of applause. I will soon tell you why they deserve that round of applause. They do some excellent work in the field of diversity and inclusion. You may be seated. Thank you very much. This event comes hot on the heels of the International Women's Day. And as you know, the theme for this year was breaking the bias. And as we look towards diversity and inclusion, it's really about breaking the barriers. And how do you break the barriers? 3 ways. Number one, you have to provide equal access. We tend to say equality, but we're not always clear what equality means. Now, if because I am differently abled, I don't like to use the word disabled. I don't think anybody is disabled. We are all abled, but some people are differently abled. If because I'm differently abled, I am not able to access education, then it doesn't really matter that we as parastatals or as government have a quota for procurement that says a certain percentage must go to differently abled people. Because if you don't have people who are prepared, then nobody can actually take up those opportunities. And you find that in many institutions, that quota is never really met. Certainly in KPC, we do not meet it on an annual basis. So it means that right from childhood, we must begin to work with children who are differently abled, whether they be blind, whether they may have mobility problems, whether they are deaf. Disability or differently abled comes in different forms. Now at KPC, we work very closely with Thika School for the Blind, where we begin to work with children at a young age and carry them right through to university. And not only that, guarantee them a role within KPC. It is important that we do this because if we do not do this, the needle will not shift. When we speak about diversity, we immediately think of the ratio of men to women. And every corporation will come here and quote, we have so many percentage of women within our organization, and of that, so many of them are in leadership. Yes, at KPC we are doing well. We're at 50-50 with a slightly higher quota than most at the leadership table. But diversity also means that we must be very deliberate about setting aside roles for people who are differently abled. So I'd like to ask my fellow corporate leaders, my fellow parastatal leaders, how many roles have you set aside for the blind? How many roles have you set aside and earmarked for people who are differently abled? Because if you do not do it, it's not just going to happen. We will be here year after year, lauding the great work that everybody is doing, but not really making a fundamental difference. The speakers before me have spoken quite a bit about inclusion. Inclusion means that, when you look around your environment, it must be comfortable for people who may not be as well abled as you are. It must be comfortable for the blind. It must be comfortable for the deaf. It must be comfortable for those who, like my friend here from Safaricom called chairman, those who are not able to move around except on chairs. In our organizations, what are we doing to make sure that we're able to serve the deaf? And I specifically speak to those of us in the public sector because public service is for all. The deaf should be able to access it. The blind should be able to access it with ease. It shouldn't be a difficult process or an inordinate, say much. But I'd like to challenge us. I'm very pleased, I must say, to see so many of my public sector colleagues with it, that we're beginning to take a shift and look outward and say, what can we do to make society challenge us that in our day-to-day businesses, at KRA, if I am blind, if I am deaf, how am I certain that the taxes I am paying are the right taxes? If I am, living within a pipeline or a railway wayleaf and I am differently abled, what precautions are we taking? How do they onboard our trains? These are the practical things we need to think about. And we also need to set aside a certain quota. We've done it at KPC. I was telling my MD that I'm not quite done with his valuation with his annual performance valuation, because we did set aside a quota for people who are differently abled. I think next week I'll be able to give you a scorecard. But if you don't set aside a quota, if you're not determined to say, we will bring in people who are differently abled, we will reserve certain roles for certain people, because, sometimes there are jobs you don't need to move around to do them. You don't need to hear to do them. There are jobs that can be done by the differently abled. But if we don't set aside and be deliberate about it, then it will not happen. So my call to us today, as we come here to celebrate and to award those who have done well, is to say, we can do so much more and we can do better, and it doesn't take much. All it takes is just a coalition of the willing, and to be resolute in making sure that we make that difference. And before we talk about breaking the barriers or breaking the bias to anybody else, we look inward and we make sure we've done it ourselves. I thank you very much for your kind attention.